Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where Paul Caiazzo and Bob Miles will be presenting Can Your IT Architecture Impact Your Cybersecurity ROI? Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Everyone joining the conference is automatically placed on mute. This webinar will be recorded and available for viewing on the TrueShield website in the resource section of the navigation bar. The recording will be sent to you within 24 to 48 hours following the presentation, and we will be collecting questions throughout the session in the GoToWebinar panel. Just type your question into the question section of the panel, and the presenters will answer as many questions as they can at the end of the presentation. Our goal today is to bring insight into cybersecurity ROI through an interactive discussion. So to start that discussion, here we have Paul Caiazzo.
Hey, thanks, Maria, and thanks to the audience for attending today. So as Maria mentioned, we're going to be talking about how or can your IT architecture impact your cybersecurity return on investment. And I think I'm going to maybe give away the end here, but the conclusion I think is relatively obvious. The answer to that is yes. I think the more interesting question is, okay, well, how? And that's what we hope to dive into today. So I'm Paul Caiazzo. I'm the co-founder of TrueShield. We're a cybersecurity company based in Washington, D.C. I've got about 15 years of experience, probably closer to 20 now, in cybersecurity, and prior to that, IT. My background's very technical. I've done quite a lot of penetration tests for credit unions and for many other types of organizations, so I've seen a lot of the symptoms of what we're actually going to discuss today. You can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, or shoot me an email if you have any questions following this presentation. And hopefully you guys take away some positive information to bring back to your credit unions. So I'm going to skip to the next slide and give you a little bit of background about TrueShield and then introduce my co-panelists. So again, we are a cybersecurity company based in Washington, D.C. A little of background on us. We started doing professional services and consulting and doing risk assessments, penetration tests, assessments against ISO, against NCUA regulations, against PCI regulations, and a variety of others. And we learned quite a lot through the virtue of doing hundreds of those assessments and seeing kind of the typical or commonplace problems that many organizations have within their environment. And a lot of those just kind of, they kind of build upon one another, wherein people think they're making the correct decisions or making the best decisions that they can with respect to how to build out their IT architecture, but that ends up having ripple effects on their security infrastructure later on down the line. And in order for us to solve those sorts of problems, we developed a managed services platform that we use to do continuous monitoring, which is part of our business today. So again, with me is co-panelist Bob Miles, and I'm going to let Bob introduce himself.
Hello, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Bob Miles. I am the Managing Director of Information Security at Ongoing Operations. I've been in the credit union industry for over 20 years, mainly focused on the security and fraud prevention and compliance aspects of the credit union industry. I've been with Ongoing Operations for about 9 months, heading up their information security practice group. That was a decision made by the investors of our TSO that was a direction that Ongoing needed to focus on and bring more credibility into that aspect of the credit union industry. A little bit about Ongoing, if we can go to the next slide. Ongoing Operations is, next slide please. Great, thank you. We focus on helping credit unions develop better member-facing technology and brands by taking care of, I like to call it the plumbing, the blocking and tackling for the credit unions to be able to get their staff to focus more on customer-facing, social media type engagements, so they don't have to spend their day after day, taking care of networking and servers and those types of things. We started off as a disaster recovery business continuity company and evolved into a cloud hosting company as well as managed telecom, and then eventually we branched out into the cybersecurity as a service line of business as well. So we have many different solutions that we offer, and right now our main focus is to try and help credit unions get their security posture better based off of what we're seeing across the cyber landscape. So that being said, turning it back over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So we are looking at the agenda slide now. We have done the About Us. We're going to move into debunking some myths. We're going to talk about kind of what contributed to the current landscape, and then move into so now what do we do from here, and then try to tie it all back up with a conversation about return on investment. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these myths. I think, unfortunately, within cybersecurity, there are a great many myths. This is so headline grabbing. I think a lot of people think they have an understanding of cybersecurity or have some perhaps misconceptions that have created a lot of what we see as some of the kind of underlying problems with IT architectures and with cybersecurity in general. And if you move to the next slide, I think we can talk about what I consider to be the chiefest among those. And I see this very, very frequently, the I'm not a target misconception. Many people that we speak with feel simply that they're not a high enough profile organization or a big enough target for them to be at risk. And the net of this is that it kind of doesn't matter. Even if you are small enough to not be on somebody's radar, you're still at risk. I think the WannaCry situation last week is just a perfect example of that. Not something where necessarily any individual was targeted, but because they effectively happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, they were unlucky. And whether or not you're targeted or unlucky is really inconsequential to the outcome. I think the thing you need to be asking yourself at the end of the day is, would you wind up in a headline if your organization had a data breach? And if the answer is yes, then you probably need to take this very seriously. And I would suggest, and probably imagine this is true, that audiences attending a webinar like this are seriously concerned about cybersecurity. Maybe don't know what to do about it, but I think I'd also be correct in stating that it's likely that other decision makers within your organization have perhaps less concern about cybersecurity, believing perhaps that they've delegated it to you, for instance. So you've got to continue to deliver the message back up the chain that well, we're too small is not really a valid argument, or we're not on somebody's radar is not a valid argument. You still have to be taking steps to protect yourself, and really that all begins with IT architecture, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Go on to the next slide, Maria. And so the other misconception I often hear is, well, we haven't had any incidents yet, so I don't really have to worry about this. And I always kind of laugh and shake my head when somebody tells me that, because it's more often the case that they simply don't know. It's almost certain that there's been some cyber incident that's gone unreported within an organization, not necessarily a loss of PII or an incident of stolen money or anything like that, but there's almost certainly some incident where an individual perhaps downloaded a piece of malware from the internet totally inadvertently, innocuously, or perhaps got a virus in their on their computer somehow that maybe the IT security organization didn't know about. And the big problem with that is the impacts of today's exploits are a lot different than what they used to be. It really used to be focused on, at least initially, on nuisances and just kind of making noise. And then it became more of a focus on being disruptive, and it's increasingly moved towards cybercrime as a service and the monetization of exploits. And again, I'm going to harken back to the WannaCry incident just last week. Perfect example of weaponized cybersecurity exploit kits that were used specifically to take money from an organization. And we found a lot of people had no idea that they were vulnerable to that particular exploit until after it blew up and their machines were cryptolocked. And there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do to squeeze that toothpaste back into that tube. So once it happens, you're basically in firefighting mode. And the next slide actually speaks even a little bit more in depth about these the statistics backing that up. So the average amount of time that it takes for an organization to realize that they've had a data breach is over 200 days. And I just want to let that sink in for a second. 200 days, that's nearly 7 months. So if you had a cybersecurity incident or a malicious actor operating within your environment for 7 months before you even realized you had a data breach, it's not even likely, it's almost certain that basically every bit of valuable information has been taken from you already. And you just learned about it, so what do you do then? Then you begin executing what I hope is in existence, your incident response plan. And that incident response plan is going to include all sorts of things like notification of members, perhaps engaging your corporate representation, perhaps engaging the NCUA. There's many costs that you have to account for when you're thinking about how to actually respond to and clean up a data breach. The average cost of a single data breach is something like $4 million in the United States. So think about that for a second. You know, these are real and material monetary losses that we're talking about. And again, if it takes 200 days to realize, actually go back one, Maria, I'm not quite done with that one yet. If it takes 7 months to realize that you've been breached, you're almost certain going to be at the upper end of that monetary spectrum in terms of loss. A couple of other ones on there that are worth calling out. So 4 out of 5 organizations are unaware that they've been breached until they're actually called by law enforcement. So that means really only 1 out of 5 organizations can do self-detection correctly. A majority of the time they don't know until they get a call saying, hey, we found your data out on the dark web, or hey, we see some attack traffic coming from IP addresses associated with you. What the heck's going on with this? And then lastly on this slide, less than 10% of organizations, so less than 1 in 10, are satisfied with their current incident response capabilities. So what that means is that they know, based upon these statistics, that it's very hard to detect, and less than 1 in 10 can actually do something about it once they've detected it. And that's a big problem. So I'm going to tie that back to the architecture discussion because all of these things really contribute to the message that if you don't properly architect your network and input good things like network segmentation and the appropriate access controls, things like that, you're going to wind up falling right smack in the middle of these statistics here, and that's not a place you want to find yourself. So go ahead to the next slide. And we're going to talk about why it's important to spend upon cybersecurity. And again, I think if you're attending this webinar, this is likely top of mind for you anyway, and some of this is just reinforcing what you already know. But I mean, you have to spend on cybersecurity because you first and foremost, you do want to try to prevent the bad things from happening as much as you possibly can. Now, that being said, it's impossible to be perfect. So you know that there's going to be some set of incidents that happen that get past your prevention mechanisms. And even if that's 1 in a billion, even if it's 1 of a trillion, that's still going to be some meaningful thing that you're going to have to do something about. So you want to try to prevent it as much as you can, but those ones that you can't prevent, you need to contain the cost. And containing the cost can really be facilitated by having a smart network architecture and having the right security control ecosystem backing that up. There's also compliance risks that you guys, with NCUA regulating you, know very well that if you're found to be non-compliant with any of the various cyber regs, could be really impactful when your auditors come and visit you. They could issue material findings, and you'll have to do something about it. You certainly don't want to have to report that to the board. That you're found to be deficient, so much better to spend in advance and make sure that you're keeping your compliance risk in check. And then the last bullet on this, which I think is just the crux of the credit union industry, is you're there to protect the members, right? You're there to do right by your member base, and you can really only truly do that as stewards of their personally identifiable information and stewards of their money by putting these correct controls in place and by putting the proper IT architectures in place to support your stewardship of their information. Now, the pivot there is to think about how doing all this stuff can actually contribute to the return on investment and perhaps the credit union's bottom line at the end of the day. And I think ongoing operations is uniquely positioned because they've been able to discover some, I think, pretty compelling metrics around how spend on IT in correct manners can actually contribute to a more financially viable credit union. And I think that's some pretty interesting stuff. So let's move to the next slide. And here are some credit unions that fell afoul of this. And I apologize if any of the audience happens to be a representative of one of these credit unions, but these are credit unions that have had data breaches that were publicly disclosed, and that these are, in my opinion, organizations that unfortunately failed to protect their members in a manner which I would deem to be sufficient, and perhaps not any sort of willfulness in their regard, but this is still something that can happen to your credit union. And I know that, again, if you're an audience member attending a webinar like this, it's probably well known that you could wind up on this list as well. The goal here, of course, is to arm you guys with some information that will help avoid that. So go ahead and move on. So how did we get here? There's kind of a long winding road that has brought us to the position that we're at today with respect to all the different issues and complications that have gotten us to the point where we're at, where we've got this sort of imbalance between the attacker and the defender. And I'm going to speak about that over the next several slides. Go ahead, Maria. So first and foremost, I think most people have a very reactionary approach to cybersecurity. They're not really thinking in a proactive manner. They're effectively waiting until the barn door is closed to try waiting for the horse to actually leave before they try to close the barn door. And I think this ties directly back to some of those misconceptions that I spoke about earlier. I think most closely back to the "I'm not a target" misconception. So since I'm not a target, I'm not going to worry about this. Or since nothing's happened to me yet, I'm not going to worry about this. It's basically saying I'm going to wait until it blows up to do something about it. And that's extremely costly. It's a very costly approach. It's something like 10 times as costly, in fact. To do incident response versus actually trying to get it right in the first place. And again, like I mentioned earlier, if it takes 7 months for you to determine that something bad has happened, it's going to be really hard to undo that at that point. Rewinding the clock is kind of not possible. So the reactionary approach, which again most people take, is really going to put you in a bad position. So that's one contributing factor to how we got to where we are. Let's move on to the next slide. The lack of strategic focus, I think, is another important one to think about, because I think a lot of times individuals within every organization I've seen, IT security gets delegated down to IT professionals, and IT professionals in many cases are obviously very sharp people that are good at what they're doing. But in some cases, that sort of strategic executive viewpoint or perspective is not really a skill set that they developed through schooling or through training. And so having that strategic focus at a business level is oftentimes lost on IT security leadership. And that's, I think, changing. I think you're seeing now more and more CISOs having a great degree of business acumen. But I think, again, we're talking about how we got to where we're at today. And I think a lot of decisions in the security space were made by tacticians rather than strategists. And so taking that tactical, technical approach to security really oftentimes means, well, I'm going to go buy the nicest next-gen firewall or the fanciest antivirus, and I'm good to go. Or they'll buy that stuff, and then they don't really fully configure it. And I've seen that so often. Very, very expensive next-gen firewalls that have all the bells and whistles, and really it's still just effectively acting as a stateful firewall and not doing much above what your basic home firewall could do, which is honestly, it's almost a misappropriation of the money to have purchased that thing. So you got to think about the full breadth and depth of your security ecosystem as supporting an overall strategy on how to protect your member base. And that program approach, that holistic program approach, is really how you have to be thinking. And I know a lot of security professionals talk about that program approach, but in the term or in the context of IT architecture, it all has to fit together from the core all the way to your perimeter protections and all of those kind of internal segmentation points in between there to support that overall mission of protecting the member base. So go ahead to the next slide, Maria. So this is, I think, another one which is very, very frequent, and I think it's emblematic of what I consider to be the problem with some regulations. People spend so much time thinking about compliance, so much time thinking about the NCUA audits or the PCI QSA, that they're not thinking about the actual goal, which is security. And our kind of corporate philosophy is that security should be the goal. In good security, a product of good security is compliance. And a secure environment is very likely to be a compliant one, but a compliant environment, this might sound counterintuitive, a compliant environment might not always be secure. And I think a good example of that is that wall of shame that we showed you earlier, where there were many credit unions, all of whom have had to have gone through some NCUA auditing and had to, at some point, be proven to be compliant, probably also to PCI, and yet they were still breached. So I think in some cases a laser-like focus on compliance almost to the detriment of security really hurts an organization, and it can contribute to a false sense of security. And I think that can be very damaging. And again, I think compliance has got to be a component of how you look at your corporate strategy or at the NCU or the credit union strategy, but it can't be the sole focus, and it's got to be taken into the context of how does my investment in IT support my focus on security and my focus on my compliance mandates as well, and not be the sole focus. If you're within an organization that looks at compliance as the be-all end-all, and I've got to make sure I get all these boxes checked, you're likely to be missing other stuff, because there's unfortunately no script that you're going to be able to follow that is going to put you into a perfect security sort of situation. So you've got to be thinking a little bit outside the box with respect to security versus compliance. So go ahead to the next slide. So I think this is another one that is, I think, really relevant to the conversation around IT architecture and cyber return on investment. Historically, there's been a significant over-reliance upon prevention, and I have a few statistics that support that. There are, in the past, in 2016 actually, a Gartner study showed that enterprise information security budgets allocated less than 30% to detection and response. So what that means is more than 70% of spend was put towards prevention controls. And now I'm not going to suggest that you should not be thinking about prevention and preventative controls, but if you're that lopsided where 70% is focused on trying to prevent it and only 30% is focused on detection and response, I think that is a direct contributor to that statistic I showed earlier, wherein it takes 201 days to detect an incident, and less than 1 in 10 organizations is comfortable with their incident response policy. That's a great reason why, and I think just that right there should maybe have you thinking about, you know, as the IT security leaders, how do I allocate spend within my organization so that we're perhaps a little bit better prepared to protect ourselves. It is estimated by Gartner that by 2020, that spend, that 30-70 split, is going to climb to 60% spent on detection and response, and I think that is really a positive trend, and I think it's, again, unfortunately, it's a reactionary trend, but it's at least a positive trend. In that same time frame, 60% of businesses are going to suffer service failures due to inability of security teams to manage risk, and so that's why you've got to be relying upon your partners like ongoing operations to help facilitate, you know, sound IT architecture management and sound security posture guidance and consultation. So again, back to some of the stuff on the slide. A lot of people think I'm going to be able to stop attacks at the network edge, and so they're thinking, okay, I'm going to install a firewall, I'm going to configure the rules on it, and then, you know, I don't know what happens next, so I'm just going to cross my fingers and hope nothing gets through there. And a lot of times firewalls are not even updated frequently, where you might input a configuration, you know, that supports some, you know, vendor agreement you have in place with some third-party service provider, and perhaps 2 years from now that agreement no longer exists. But unfortunately, maybe because staff has left or because nobody's, you know, truly looking at the firewall on a regular basis, those rules don't get updated. So I think I would be willing to bet, actually, that of the attendees, you know, probably a significant percentage, I would say 70%, something like that, you have rules on your firewall that you don't need or that are no longer in need by the business. And that's stuff that really, again, is emblematic of a not a great sort of focus on keeping up with security. And a lot of times it becomes a symptom of the fact that in credit unions specifically, IT teams are probably, you know, small with very large challenges in front of them, and focused on keeping the operation running is more important than thinking about all of the nuance and idiosyncrasies of cybersecurity. Another facet of this over-reliance upon prevention, so we've tried to stop attacks at the edge, or we're going to try to stop attacks at the endpoint. So how do you do that? We're going to put some antivirus on there. We're going to hopefully configure automatic updates so that it gets updated frequently. Not everybody does that, which means you've got antivirus that's not even up to date. And then again, we're going to cross our fingers and hope nothing bad happens. And I think, you know, it should be obvious to the audience members that this sort of approach is not really sufficient to address the current level of risk that's out there in the world. But I'm telling you with absolute authority, this is how many organizations are addressing this problem. Not just within the credit union space, but within other industries as well. They're thinking firewall and antivirus and I'm covered. And unfortunately, that simply does not work. So go ahead and move to the next slide. So also, one thing we see pretty frequently is the security as a project. And what I'm really talking about there, this actually ties back to some of the compliance stuff that I talked about earlier. An organization will take a point in time snapshot security posture. Maybe they'll do a penetration test once a year, and they only do that because they've got to, because NCUA says you must. And then they hand that off, and basically that's it. And perhaps the better performing organizations over the course of the subsequent year will take steps to address the issues that were discovered during the penetration test. But the thing that they really miss is that pen test or that assessment or that project that you undertook really only reveals how you did at that moment in time. And I think everybody would agree that the cyber threat landscape is probably the fastest moving component of IT in existence, right? So IT changes every day, but IT security changes every second. Even I'm going to go back to WannaCry again. This happened last week, and if you're not entirely familiar with the technical intricacies of it, so there happened to be a kill switch that somebody accidentally happened upon, which stopped that from becoming a major incident. It already was a major incident in terms of outbreak, but the actual financial hit from WannaCry actually has only amounted to something like $100,000, believe it or not. Now, don't take that for meaning that it wasn't a significant incident. There were hundreds of thousands of organizations that were compromised, but only $100,000. So what do the bad guys do? They learn their lesson, and so there's actually a new variant of that out that does not have the kill switch. And there's also new variants being developed currently that are for sale on the dark web using other new exploits. So the net there is the threat landscape is constantly changing. And so if you're taking the perspective that I'm going to do a security project, in September, and I'm going to be good for the year, then I hate to tell you this, but that's a flawed approach, and you're probably going to wind up in bad shape because of it. So go ahead and move to the next slide. So what do we do now? I think this is the question that we really want to focus on, and I think there are things that we can do from an architecture perspective to better protect our organizations, and we're going to talk some about that stuff. But I want to talk first, before handing back to Bob to finish our presentation off here, about a philosophy around cybersecurity, and that's on the next slide, Maria. The philosophy really revolves around these four components: prevention, detection, containment, and eradication. And if you structure your IT architecture such that you have controls that support each of these puzzle pieces, you're going to be in a position of strength when you're thinking about how your cybersecurity posture actually is. So prevention, we talked about firewalls and antivirus and access controls and stuff like that. Detection, that really comes down to having a good IDS, having a SIM or SIM as a service, and having the ability to detect when bad things have happened, and then following that, so you've detected it, then you can quickly contain it, because that speed of detection is one of the most direct factors that will contribute to your ability to contain and then eradicate, because if you can contain to a small footprint, you're going to be able to eradicate that much more quickly. This, of course, assumes that you've got an adequate incident response policy, and that's tested, and that you're working with a good partner that can help you through some of the disaster recovery stuff like ongoing operations. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Bob, and Bob's going to talk through some of these specific controls that support all this stuff.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the controls that are in place that help to prevent some types of incidents, but aren't really an all-in-one solution. And as you see, there's three huts on this presentation, on this slide, that identify proxy servers, antivirus, and spam. Those are all need to have, but as Paul was discussing earlier, like for example, proxy servers can be bypassed, proxy servers can be exploited. Antivirus is signature-based, is almost not completely obsolete, but it's getting there with zero-day exploits. The signatures just aren't there to identify them when they're released, when it's 0 day. And I remember back in 2003 when we were standing around at a SANS training for incident response and wondering when the first 0 day exploit would be announced. And today there's an average of 50 every single day that are released. So like Paul said, times have changed. It's a different world out there. And spam, I would probably rather talk about, phishing, which, could be, I mean, that is probably the primary channel right now that we're seeing. They're not really trying to attack the perimeters anymore. They're trying to get through to the insider to, try and coerce them and trick them into clicking on a link. Next slide, please. So back to the discussion around architecture. Firewalls are a tremendous control to have in place. They're great because they block traffic, but they're also terrible because they allow traffic. So I've seen so many different architectures where, like Paul talked about as well, they have these really nice new next-gen firewalls. It looks at all layers of the OSI model, but it's just doing stateful inspection. And they have outbound allowed from everyone, all ports, all protocols. They're not doing any egress filtering whatsoever. They're just sitting at the perimeter and they check the box off that they've got a firewall. And most of the time, the change control, change management around that is weak, if not non-existent. So there's lots of people going in, making changes, not really sure what they're changing, thinking they're making the right access control list, but not, most of the time the staff doesn't really have a good understanding of firewalls and firewall rules. So you get configurations that get insecure. They open up ports and protocols they don't even realize. Of course, the DMZ is a must-have, especially for any internet-facing servers and services that you've got. Hopefully everyone understands they need to have, a demilitarized zone and have that firewalled off from the private network and your private server networks to make sure that if they are compromised, they can't laterally move into any other more secure areas of your networks. And again, it's back to depending on making sure that those firewalls are configured correctly, that they're not passing, known Windows ports that have vulnerabilities like the SMB vulnerability that enables the WannaCry, and as well as, any of these new exploits. And then data loss prevention is getting a lot of attention now, but again, there's no one single solution to get your posture perfect. It's a constantly moving target that needs to have attention every single day. Next slide, please. So we've got the intrusion detection. We've got the guy up in the tower that's looking across the network, and then you've got the big walls that are built up to try to stop the attacks. And those are two key components as well. It's just there is a human factor involved, as well as the appliance-based controls, and that means you've got to have someone that's looking at what the detection piece is doing, and also following up with what the prevention, if you do have an active intrusion prevention system that's actually working the way it should, you need to have someone that's following up on that to verify and validate that whatever that particular exploit was indeed prevented. And then how do you, if it wasn't, then you've got to go in and go back and make sure you fix what you had wrong, because it's very easy to put these devices in place and think they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but in reality they're not. Next slide, please. Other best practices. I've seen so many different environments, credit union, community banks, that are completely flat, that if you gained access to their network, you had visibility through the entire enterprise. And I've also seen it where they've got VLANs in place, so they're tagging the VLAN at the switch. However, there's no access controls between the VLANs. So you you're on VLAN, the native VLAN, you can get to the ATM VLAN, you can get to the voice VLAN, you can get to any VLAN you want. They just, again, it's back to checking the box. Do you have VLANs? Do you have VLAN segmentation? Yes, check the box. Doesn't mean it's doing anything, but it's very common. I come across that probably 6 or 7 out of 10 times when I do a discovery on credit union networks. It's very common. And then pen testing, again, like Paul said, the requirements are usually, like for PCI, once a year or after any major changes, you do pen testing. And that's great for that one particular second that you had the pen testing done. But what happens the next day when someone goes in and installs a new application or a module to some web service that you're hosting that's available to the world, and all of a sudden you're at risk, and then it's another 364 days before you're going to do the pen test because you don't consider that whatever you've done a major change. So that's the problem with the false sense of security around I do pen testing once a year. It's just like we said, it's a snapshot in time. Next slide, please. So this particular slide is they're firing over the wall now. They're not really trying to attack the perimeter as much as they're trying to bypass all of the nice layers of security you've got in place in intrusion detection and intrusion prevention and go right to the end user. And hopefully they're going to get the administrator. They're going to trick the administrator into giving them their credentials, or they're going to look for third parties that is a soft target that has connectivity into your network, and they're going to go that way because they know they have weaker controls than what you have. So they're finding their way in. It's not how it used to be. Next slide. So this is the perimeter collapsing. This is, you've got the firewalls in place, you've got the IDS, you've got all that. They're still getting in. There's no silver bullet. I hate to use silver bullet, but there is no silver bullet. And the layered approach is the best approach, but you also have to have visibility, a holistic view of what's going on in your environment at any given time. You have to have the ability to see that and detect and react as soon as possible. You can't allow it to go on for 7 months or you're going to be on the wall. Next slide, please. So at this point, Jason, can you step in here and talk about the return on investment and what this means as far as the cost in this example?
I don't know that I'll do a great job with this particular example on the slide, but I'm Jason Gale. I'm Executive Vice President at Ongoing Operations. And when we started partnering up with some of our credit union investors, we were looking at figuring out what does software cost and what is the expected return on investment. And so when you're looking at this, what's your average loss experience? Paul was talking about an incident costing about $4 million. What's the cost of countermeasuring it and multiplying that by 100%? This is a good example, and we can all read through it together, where you're looking at a 2,000% return on investment on $52,000 annual average loss versus the cost of the software being $2,600. And I think it's a really good way to think about it. But as we're credit unions and we're thinking about what does it take to protect my credit union, we're looking at it on a holistic level and saying, the billion-dollar credit unions, we have seen a range And it's been, sometimes it's shocking how little they spend. But typically, a credit union that's $1 billion in assets is spending about $250,000 to $350,000 a year between the tools, whether it's antivirus and firewalls, et cetera, or it's personnel. The CISO, the network security engineer, whose responsibility is to monitor. And what we definitely have understood, and a large part of why we got into the industry, is there's a lack of an ability of a $100 million or $500 million credit union who's got 11% of their revenue budgeted for IT to commit to $250,000 or more of spending on information security. So really the question becomes, what does a smaller credit union do? They still have the same pile of gold. They still have the same member data to protect. As Paul talked about quite earlier, oftentimes the attacks aren't targeted, so they're still in the line of fire. How do you do all these things? And certainly, ongoing operations believes it's a combination of investing in the right set of tools, but also having access to the consultants or the CISOs who really understand how to monitor the network, monitor the logs, and be actively involved. And if you're looking at a $4 million per incident average loss, and you're spending $150,000 to $200,000 a year, it's still a pretty big number, but you start getting back into a high return on investment.
Yeah, and I just want to echo those same comments, Jason. This is Paul again. So I think specifically the message here is that the loss per incident times the number of incidents that are going to occur in a given year is what you could expect to spend. There is some fuzziness to that math because the number of incidents per year, you're going to have to do a little bit of projection, perhaps based upon something like the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report or the Ponemon Institute report. But you can find some statistics around how likely an event like that is to occur, and then think about how much each of those costs. If you come up with an annual number on that, really the way you should be thinking is the cost of the countermeasure to prevent or mitigate that risk needs to be less than what I'm spending annually. Otherwise, it's going to be a net loss, and there's going to be no return on the investment. So spend less on the countermeasure than what you can expect to lose, and consider the rest of that to be cost avoidance. And that truly does become a direct return on the investment there. But then additionally, I think what I've found is that organizations that think strategically about putting together security ecosystems wind up having compounded returns on investment because they're going to find efficiencies within their internal organization and within their internal infrastructure to probably offset costs from maybe one bucket to another and wind up at the end of the day saving quite a bit more money. Even though, as Jason rightly noted, we're not talking peanuts here, that's a great way to avoid significant costs and significant potential liabilities. So I think there's one more slide, Maria. Right, so the ROI of the cyber programs, I think at the end of the day, this is a blueprint that you can use to think about how you're looking at your ecosystem. And we're not going to suggest a dollar amount for each of these because there's going to be very kind of nuanced considerations that you're going to have to take into account when you're thinking about how this impacts your organization. But you should be thinking about each of these as a necessary component of your security posture. Calculate that up at the end of the year, and then think about this from that perspective of the annual loss expectancy, or that ALE. So again, that's cost per incident times the likelihood of the incident, and then calculate that up as your potential total cyber budget. So again, use it as a blueprint. Take that home and think about how you would calculate these internally. It's quite likely that your organization has already spent on some of this stuff. Perhaps you've already got an IDS that was in 2015 budget. There's no real problem with it. Not necessarily need to upgrade it, but you do have to maintain it, and that's a cost you probably want to consider. So that's all stuff that will help you at the end of the day calculate what your total cyber budget should actually be. So with that said, that's the entirety of our content for today's webinar. We do have the ability to take some questions. So if there are some questions, Maria, can you perhaps read those off?
Definitely. Thanks, Paul. I do have a few questions for our presenters. The first one would go to Paul. Paul, how real are cyber threats for companies not typically targeted by cyber criminals?
Well, yeah. That's a good question. I think there's a couple ways to think about that. First off, like I said earlier, the kind of the tagline I use is it doesn't matter if you're targeted or if you're just unlucky. And I think that's a very, very true statement. I've seen organizations that by virtue of their size or just by virtue of industry, I've seen construction companies go out of business because they've been hit by ransomware. Not an organization type that would be typically attacked or targeted by cyber criminals, but were severely impacted by it to the point where they had to literally shut down operations. I think it's less relevant to a credit union discussion, though, because I think it's quite likely that, especially when we're talking about some of the, our nation's credit unions that support, either armed services or intelligence community or other, critical infrastructure sort of providers, or even big company credit unions, they are going to be targeted. And I think it's kind of naive to think they're not. That's not an indictment of anyone, or hopefully nobody takes that as an insult, but there certainly are targets of cyber criminals. But again, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter if you're targeted or not. If you're not doing a good job with cyber hygiene, if you're not keeping up with patching, if you're not doing all the stuff that Bob talked about with the security ecosystem, that layered approach, then you're still going to be at major risk, and you got to do something about it. So that's where you got to take that blended approach. And think about security not just as a one-time, point-in-time project, but as an evolving life cycle that includes an ecosystem of tools, all designed at the end of the day to help you protect your member base.
Great, thanks, Paul. I do have a question for Bob. Bob, can we predict cybercrime rather than simply responding to it?
Good question. The answer is, I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know anyone that does. However, you can get a fairly good idea of someone's security posture based off of some just very easy best practice findings that you can discover doing some reconnaissance. And just basically, if they've got unsecure ports or protocols open to the internet, if they've got a SSL certificate that supports weak ciphers, some of those really easy indicators that their posture's probably not as good as it should be, then it's fairly easy to determine that they are a very good candidate to be breached. So there's a lot of indicators that are very easy to find. So the answer is, to a point, yes. You can get a very good idea on someone's security posture very quickly to see if they're a candidate for a breach.
Great, thank you, Bob. Next question is to Paul. Paul, with WannaCry happening last week, we want to know, what steps can I take to protect my credit union against ransomware?
Okay, I'm glad you got that question because it's so top of mind, and I've gotten that question a lot over the last week. So WannaCry exploited a specific vulnerability in Microsoft Windows. All versions of Microsoft Windows are vulnerable to it, all, which should be terrifying in and of itself. And a little bit of background on it, the vulnerability itself was known to our intelligence community. I think that one was NSA, could have been CIA, I can't recall, and used as part of our, our government intelligence program. Interestingly, the whole incident has kind of spurred some new discussion around whether or not our nation states should be cultivating, weapons of kind of mass digital destruction. And Microsoft has actually released a statement, somewhat self-serving, trying to, I think, do a little bit of CYA, but that there should be what they're calling a digital Geneva Convention, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea of, just getting on the table what cyber weapons exist. Now, of course, that tips our hand from an intelligence perspective, and being a patriotic American, I wouldn't want to give away any of our secrets in that regard. Now, that being said, so back to WannaCry specifically, it exploited a specific vulnerability in Microsoft Windows, including all those out-of-date and end-of-life operating systems like XP and Server 2003. And while I have, beat the drum as loud as I can for years to get off of those unsupported operating systems, I know that there are many organizations that still rely upon them. Hopefully, nobody on the in the audience today, but if you do have XP or 2003 in your environment, I'm going to say it again: get off of those operating systems as quickly as you can. But you are saved, by the goodwill of Microsoft, because they actually did release patches for those unsupported operating systems to the world at large. And typically, you have to pay a significant amount of money to get what Microsoft calls custom support for patches for unsupported operating systems. But they knew these were such significant and serious incidents that they released a patch. The patch is MS17-010, and you should go and download that. And make sure that your systems are patched to it. If you look at our blog, we have an article written specifically about this that'll also give you a link to a tool that you can use to scan your devices to find out whether or not they are vulnerable, and then you should patch the ones that are immediate. That's step one. Patch. And to support that, just a quick statistic from the Ponemon Institute study: 70% of data breaches are the result of exploits against patchable vulnerabilities. So if you keep up with patches, you're going to stop 70% of bad stuff from happening to you. Now, WannaCry, again, specifically an interesting component of how WannaCry worked, it's a worm. So it self-propagates. And so what it does is once it gains a foothold, it's going to scan some actually random set of IP addresses looking for other machines that are vulnerable. And the way that it does that is it looks at port 445, which is server message block, SMB, which is enabled by default in Windows. And so a couple things there. After you get off this phone, make sure you go and ensure that your firewall blocks inbound 445. Port 445 should not be allowed from the internet. If it is, you're at significant risk of a WannaCry infection. And those two things alone right there will stop you from being susceptible to WannaCry. Now, I want to provide some kind of forward-thinking cautionary advice here. That exploit is one of many that were included in that data dump stolen from our intelligence community. And I know that there are currently cybercriminals working on the effectively next version of it, which is going to exploit remote desktop protocol. So, patch, number one, patch, but number two, make sure you block port 3389 for the internet, which is Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol. That's just a security best practice anyway, but a lot of organizations leave remote desktop open just for ease of administration, or in my opinion, what I'll ultimately just call laziness. They leave it open so people can remotely log into stuff, and obviously that's a pretty significant risk factor right there. So for WannaCry, again, patch and block 445. For what I believe to be coming next, patch and block remote desktop protocol 3389.
Great, thanks, Paul. One last question. This one's for Bob. Bob, how do I address client, third-party, or vendor organizations about their vulnerabilities that might be putting my credit union at risk?
The first step in doing that is identifying the list of what you would determine as critical vendors. And any vendor that has access to, stores, transmits, or processes PII or member data, they absolutely belong on the list of critical vendors. That's the first step. The next step is, many times I see that business units make decisions around software and third-party vendors outside of IT that don't involve IT in the due diligence process that needs to happen when a critical vendor is onboarded. So that needs to be centralized, whether it's in IT or there is a separate vendor management business unit. So you've got to get some sides around that as well. You've also have to get the right technical person looking at different reports like a SOC 2 or an SSAE 16 that addresses complementary end user results. You also need to make sure they're following all the compliance guidelines that the credit union needs to comply with as well, as far as, like we talked about, the pen testing, the vulnerability scanning, the background checks, and basically they need to be as secure, if not more secure, as your credit union is. And you need to keep that program up. It's not you do it once and forget about it. You need to keep rotating in through that and starting over once you get to the end of the list.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, great. Paul and Bob covered a lot of great aspects of cybersecurity today, and we did answer a number of questions. If we did not get to your question, I will email you tomorrow and have an answer for you. We had a lot of awesome content covered and not a lot of time. So we will be including a link to the recording of this webinar in our follow-up emails that you'll be receiving within about 24 to 48 hours. Also, we'll have a PDF of the presentation. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.